Yeah.
All right, can you hear me now? All right, great. Mandatory technical difficulties at the start of every online meeting, of course. So the purpose of this meeting is to revive awareness. As you all know, we've had about a year-long hiatus due to a funding shortfall. Funding is back, project is reviving. There's not a lot of progress to report that's different from the last time we had a meeting, but this is basically to bring us all back up to speed and start to discuss the next steps that will be coming down the pipe. The agenda that we're looking at here today is first to introduce all of the people that are panelists, people that will be speaking today and are involved in the project. I'll give a summary of the project history. Hunter will give a presentation of the 30% preliminary designs for the dike modification and setback dike construction. Chris Laity and Hunter White will give of some Sand Lake Road crossings information, and then we'll break into an introduction. So with that, the introductions, I'll introduce myself first. I'm Noel Batchelor. I'm the Oregon State Parks ecologist in the Salem office, and I've been involved with this project for a very long time. So I come to see myself as sort of the historian of the project. And with that, I would pass this on to the rest of the team to introduce themselves.
Hi everyone, my name is Hunter White. I'm a civil and water resources engineer with ESA. I've been working on this design since about 2019, and I've seen a lot of you at past meetings. Look forward to giving you an update.
Hello, I'm Christy LeBrecq for Local Casters Partnerships.
And I'm Chris Laity, the Public Works Director for the county.
Maybe the rest of the OPRD folks.
I'm Team Pyle, I'm a resource specialist at Oregon State Parks.
Good afternoon, everybody. Jason Elkin. I'm the park manager at Cape Legat State Park, which includes, like I said, State National.
District Manager.
I'm partnership.
All right, great, thank you. With those introductions in place, I'll move on to the first portion of the agenda, which is the history of the project. I'll be talking about the last 10 years of history, but first I'll set the stage, the geography of the area here. Point out, as everyone in the room is aware, I'm sure, of these features, but for those on the webinar that might not be aware, the park boundary for Sitka State Natural Area is in red. The first creek that you see here south of the setback dike is Reneke Creek. This is the actual dike. Sorry, I said setback dike earlier. This is the existing dike, and this is Reneke Creek. This is Belts Creek. This is a conceptual kind of dart on the wall approximate location for the setback dike. This is the Tierra del Mar ditch, Sand Lake Road ditch, East Marsh, and No Name Creek. East Marsh and No Name Creek, those are both names that don't really exist on maps, but that's what we've been calling them for the last 8 or so years in this planning process. Of course, Tierra del Mar is right here, the community of Tierra del Mar. Sand Lake to the north of the existing dike, and we've been calling this marsh, everyone's been calling this marsh Belts Marsh for the last 100 years or so. With that geography out of the way, why are we doing this? And the background is that the current dike is failing, the tide gate especially. And you'll see in the photos here to the right that the existing tide gate is pretty small. This is the only tide gate that services the entire half-mile long dike. There's about 80-ish acres of marshland that's behind the dike right now, and all of that water has to come out of this tiny hole. which causes water to back up either on the way in or on the way out. You can see also in this other inset photo here that the water has been eroding away the dike itself. The dike face on the inside of the dike should be clear out to the end of these wing walls on the box culvert. This has been eroded away approximately 8 feet. And has actually moved quite a bit since I've been involved with the project for the last 10 years. The existing tide gate flap no longer has any planks on it. It used to have 4 by 12-ish planks that covered the opening to the dike. When that flap would swing down and cover the box culvert, that would keep any tides from entering the land behind the dike. Now that the planks are all gone, water rushes through this thing like a fire hose, very high water velocities, which explain a lot of this erosion that we're seeing on the inside of the dike as the water scours and eddies as it roils through this box culvert. The existing dike's low point is only 12.2 feet, and the highest recorded tide is also 12.2 feet. So there's not much room there for any sort of sea level rise. The existing dike and tide gate also restrict fish passage to Belts and Reneke creeks, largely because of the excessive velocity running through this pipe. Most of the time, the water running through this box culvert for the tide gate is going at far beyond the swimming speed of especially juvenile fish, but it's also a partial barrier to adult fish. So over the history of the project, what has been done so far? Well, the property was acquired in 2014, and shortly thereafter, we started a series of assessments of biological, recreational, scenic, cultural resources, recreational capacity, and needs, and that all culminated in a master plan. After that master plan, we continued to look at what the options were for modifying the existing dike to fix it in some way, deal with the situation of both the need for protection of Tierra del Mar and for meeting the ecological goals. And so we spun off 2-3 different hydrological studies to study how surface water was moving through the dike and what would be expected under different kinds of alteration scenarios. Ultimately, in 2019, we reviewed a whole series of different alternatives and arrived at a decision of which one to pursue. And I'll get into that in more detail here in a second. Over the last 10 years, there have been at least 22 stakeholder meetings that have been advertised and actively maintained and an email list subscription spot on the website where anyone who would like to receive updates can sign up for that. We also met with adjacent landowners, and we had ongoing email collaboration with the QDM Community Association and interested landowners that reach out to us by email and phone. So the scenarios that we've assessed over these years include a range of options. Some of them are more reference conditions or bookends, like for example, the no action existing condition alternative, which is really not an option. And since it's failing now, this is just something that is assessed along with everything else to show, what happens if you do nothing. On the other end of the spectrum, dike breach. This is something that is another bookend. It's been assessed to see what the water levels were before 1939 and what they would be. Two alternatives over the years have been some sort of either muted type regulator, existing dike with different closure settings, form of tide gate that closes at a set point that is chosen at the time. And what it does is it stays open for a certain amount of time until the water reaches a certain predetermined height at which we want it to close. So you could choose to have it close at 7 feet. That's an option, and those things were all assessed, and I'll show a graphic of that on a future slide. Then the last alternative that we've assessed is the setback dike option, which would be to create a smaller, modern dike structure to breach the existing dike and either bridge it or put a boardwalk or somehow allow for continued recreational access across from the parking area into the land to the west of the marsh. And here are, this slide is really just kind of an example. This is from 2019, and it shows the range of alternatives that were assessed as part of that 2019 technical team process. And in that process, we assessed the existing condition, the modern tie gate with a 7-foot closure, modern tie gate with an 8-foot closure setting, 9 feet, 10 feet, breach, and the setback dike with a modern tie gate. These colors on here represent the frequency that different portions of the marsh would experience tide water. So what you're seeing here in the scale is the brown being 1 day in February. This is just an example month. You would have to do this for every month to have a comprehensive picture. But the brown would be 1 day, and on the other side of the spectrum, the kind of purple lavender color would be 20+ days of tide inundation. As you can see, each alternative has different effects on the frequency that tide water would reach different places within the marsh and within Tierra del Mar. All right, so then in video format, we have this running in a model of how water flows. And I'll sort of set the stage here for what you're seeing here on the screen. The upper left photo is the existing condition. Existing dike, existing tide gate. This is the do nothing situation with the current water. The next one over to the right is the modern tide gate with an 8-foot closure setting. The next one is a breach, or this could also be seen as the pre-dike, let's say the 1935 scenario. And then the furthest to the right image is the setback dike. And the black bar represents an approximate location for the setback dike. This is the 2019 video. It's been up on our webpage for now nearly 5 years. What you're seeing down at the bottom is a graph of how high the tide level is. The blue line here is the water outside of the dike. That's the natural Sand Lake estuary tide. It would also be the tide that would be expected under a no dike situation, like a pre-1935. These other lines, like the orange and the red and the green, are all the variants of modern tide gate, existing condition, or setback bed. And this blue color that is down here is rainfall. This is a simulated about 50-year storm event. So it's a pretty big storm. And what we're seeing here, if you look at the green line, and if you look at the image in the upper left, is that the water stays in Phelps Marsh for days on end after a big rainstorm. The small hole in the dike, the existing tide gate, is like an hourglass, and it just doesn't allow that sand out and that water out fast enough for the tide to really ever go out under a big rainstorm event like that. So most of this water that's inside the dike in this situation is storm water. It's fresh water. It does have some salt water in it, but it's predominantly storm water.
No, can you screen share? Because they're not seeing it online.
Oh.
Sorry.
Great. Let's see here. Sorry about that, everyone online. I will go back and cover some of those slides. rid of this little thing. There we go. Some slides. All right. Sorry, everyone. I apologize for that. I do this twice. The red outline is the park boundary. The black line here is the existing dike, Belts Dike. The existing tide gate is here. The Belts Marsh is to the south of the existing tide gate. Sand Lake is to the north. Renegade Creek is the first creek that you come to south of Belts Dike. Belts Creek is the next creek. And then we have Tierra Del Mar Ditch, Sand Lake Road Ditch, what we've been calling No Name Creek, and what we've been calling East Marsh. Of course, Tierra Del Mar, the community, is right here. And I think that covers everything. The features that I was pointing out earlier to those that are here in the live audience is the size of this existing tide gate. This is about a 4x4 opening in the dike, and it's a concrete box culvert. The flap here used to have 4x12s on it. Those 4x12s are all gone now, so water rushes through unimpeded, and it blasts through this thing like a fire hose. This photo at the bottom is showing the amount of erosion that's happened inside of the dike as a result of the really high water velocity blasting through the tide gate. We get eddies here that eat away at the inside of the tide gate. This tide gate, I didn't mention this before, but this tide gate is not repairable legally because of modern fish passage laws. So it would have to be replaced with something bigger and better, like a meter tidal regulator or something else that meets modern fish passage requirements. I went over this verbally. I think probably most people online heard me say most of this stuff already, so I'll skip past that one and that one. Pointing out these alternatives that we looked at before. This is the existing condition, do nothing, leave the tide gate exactly as it is. As a bookend reference condition, the other end of the spectrum is to breach the existing dike. Then the more actively pursued options are muted tidal regulator. Shown here, this one has 3 doors side hinged that have a set closure setting, which can be chosen by as part of the construction design. And then the setback dike here, shown in red, is the last option that was pursued, which would have a muted tidal regulator in it, but a much smaller one because it only has to pass the water from a couple of creeks. Well, a couple of ditches in one creek. This setback dike would be accompanied by a breach of some sort in the existing dike, maybe with a bridge over it, maybe with a boardwalk. That is yet to be determined. Then this graphic I was explaining also as an example. There are many other graphics similar to this, but this one is showing the month of February and the number of days in the month of February that each spot on this map experienced tide water. The hotter the color, the more days, well, not the hotter the color. The purple color is the most days of water. The brown color is very few days, like 1 day tide water being present at that spot on the map. Then here's where we were with the video, and I'll start this back up again. The upper left is the existing condition up here. It's the existing dike and the broken tide gate that we already have. We have the modern tide gate with an 8-foot closure setting as the second frame. The third frame is the no dike situation. This could be seen as 1935 or before, or it could be a breach. This is just as if there were no dike at all. This is what you would see in terms of water. And then the setback dike is the frame furthest to the right. The graph at the bottom shows the water surface elevation that is modeled or observed to occur in each of these locations. So in the case of the blue line, this is the water levels that were observed outside of the dike. These other lines are what would be expected under either the modern tide gate with an 8-foot closure setting in this orange color, the setback dike alternative in this sort of reddish color, and the existing condition in this greenish color. The blue color at the bottom here is rainfall. And this rainfall event that we're seeing here is a 50-year storm event, approximately. And what we're seeing, both in this graph and up in the map above, is that under these circumstances of a large rainfall event, the water just doesn't go out for days. And this is because of the small carrying capacity of that undersized culvert through the dike. So days on end, water in, whereas the other potential alternatives all flush out that tide water every day, every tide cycle without much of an issue. There are minor differences in how quickly it goes out, as you'll see, as it runs through these scenarios. And it's most obvious when we scooted ahead to a 100-year storm event, coupled with a 12.2 king tide, which is the highest ever observed tide that we know of in Sand Lake. So this blue here is like a ton of rain, right? And this 12.2 foot tide here is coming up on the screen. You'll see how far the water penetrates into the south as a result of that incoming tide. And see it passes way down into here. And you'll see it also passes way down into that terrain in the existing condition as well. Passes through somewhat also in the other alternatives, but as you'll see, they all respond a little bit differently. The existing condition, however, stays in, as I said before, for days on end, and it is really the worst case scenario as far as surface water near Tierra del Mar goes. You'll note also that on an outgoing tide, the setback dike drains out a little bit faster than the modern tide gate through the existing dike. So that's the gist of that video. And this is available on our website, and it has been for quite some time. I will move on to the next slide, which is Oregon Parks and Recreation Department's stated goals for this project. Number one is that the design should result in virtually no increase in tidewater, stormwater, or elevated groundwater on private properties in Tierra del Mar. Number two is the design should result in meaningful improvements to estuary and fish habitats in the area inside the existing dike. Number three, we should see some fish passage improvements to the mouth of Reneke and Belts Creeks. Recreational access should continue, and the design should route Reneke Creek to the marsh naturally and not in a ditch. So comparing the pros and cons of the various alternatives. This was all done in 2019. There was a public tech team process to sort of go through all of these alternatives and sort of hear testimony from a variety of standpoints. And these collected pros and cons kind of get at the content of that 2019 process. So the no action alternative really doesn't have any pros. It's just a net negative. Leaving it as it is causing water situation of anything. A pro of being really good for the natural estuary, but it has cons of impacting and putting tidewater on private properties. This dike breach alternative does not meet OPRD's goals for the project, and so it is not being evaluated further. Modern tide gates in the existing dike is another alternative that has been assessed over the years. The pros of this is that it limits tides reaching private properties in Tierra del Mar. It lets stormwater out efficiently. It gives some fish passage, but the cons are the fish passage is not perfect. There would still be a relatively small opening in the dike with excessive velocities during certain stages, which would cause potentially erosion, scour, changes in the way that sediment accumulates in the mouth of the dike. It's better, but it's not as good as the setback dike in terms of overall package. The setback dike appears to offer the best balance of societal and ecological goals for the property. It gives pretty much totally unfettered fish passage to the mouths of Belts and Reneke creeks. It would be resilient to sea level rise to some extent because the setback deck would be built taller than the existing deck. 17 feet would be the initial height of the setback deck. The highest height observed is 12.2 feet. The existing deck, belt deck, has a low point of 12.2 feet. So we have a little bit more freeboard there for the setback deck for sea level rise and resilience. It also would allow for sediment accumulation potentially in the marsh between the setback dike and the existing dike, which could allow the marsh to keep up with sea level rise. The sediment deposition inside the marsh could potentially accumulate to the extent that that marsh lifts itself up and keeps pace and pretty much stays the same. This is by no means proven. Nobody knows for sure, but it seems to be a relatively safe bet. The cons for the setback dike are that it would be constructed through high value wetland habitat. I mean, the dike would be about a 1.5 acre fill inside of an existing nice quality marsh. That could be somewhat self-mitigating because we would have estuarine gain north of the setback dike, and I'll get to that later. Another con would be that the setback dike would have an expensive tide gate structure, needed tidal regulator built into it that would have maintenance requirements. There could be issues with beavers, and it would be expensive. So that's the total package of pros and cons that went into the decision point in 2020. And in 2020, Oregon Parks and Recreation Department leadership, after presenting the options to the Tillamook County Commission and to the Oregon Parks and Recreation Commission, and after the series of four tech team meetings in this building in 2019, OPRD leadership chose the new setback dike as the alternative to pursue. And in 2020, issued a fact sheet about that decision, which is still on our website to this day. And in the summer of 2020, while we were looking into pursuing grants, OPRD received a letter of support from the Cherry Marketing Association. Then 2020, right? That was COVID year. Everything got kind of derailed. OPRD staff no longer had capacity to really pursue this. And fortunately, Tillamook Estuaries Partnership was there with the expertise and the grant giving ability to step in and be a great partner in helping to continue to move this forward. And so in 2020, Tillamook Estuaries Partnership really took the reins on finding money, finding contractor, and moving design forward. And that has moved us up to our current status of 30% design. This process that was undertaken by Tillamook Estuaries Partnership in coordination with Oregon Parks and Recreation Department involved hiring environmental science associates, and you'll hear from Hunter White on a lot of this work coming up as the next presentation, but it involved trying to figure out exactly where a setback dike would need to be. And this is kind of experimental. You have to try different places, model them, and see how they turn out. So there was a little bit of moving it around and finding the sweet spot for where a setback dike would be. We also had to investigate what exactly would happen to Belts Dike itself. Would it be a single breach, or would it be multiple breaches? Would there be bridges? Would there be boardwalks? These are all the kinds of things that were assessed in the first 30% of design. As a kind of parallel process, ESA also did a study of stormwater accumulation in the community of Tierra del Mar and have issued findings on that showed that there are closed basins in Tierra del Mar, shown in this red and yellow color, that accumulate stormwater and don't have much of a way of escaping. So the ditch network, et cetera, are currently part of the problem for why these water accumulation areas are in place. This study is outside of the scope of what we'll be talking about today, but I just wanted to mention that this work was done and is available for review. So last summer and leading up to where we are today, we have the scenarios that were assessed for what I've been calling tapping on the wall to find the stud. You don't know where exactly this dike needs to be until you try a few places. So tap, tap, should it go here? No. Should it go here? Here's the sweet spot right here. So we found that using the criterion of needing enough storage basin for the stormwater that would be coming down from No Name Creek, Tierra Del Mar, or Sand Lake Road Ditch and Tierra Del Mar Ditch, the storage basin capacity was such that the setback dike had to be pretty far north to handle all that water. At the same time, we're looking to minimize the potential size of the setback dike because this is a lot of area of nice marsh that would be impacted by placing the structure here. So in the end, alternative one was the only alternative that met all of the goals and criteria for this project. It was the furthest north. It had adequate capacity to store stormwater that would be flowing downhill into the marsh before, well, the setback deck has a tide gate in it. And when the tide comes in, that tide gate will be closed. While that tide gate is closed, that there has to be enough space behind the setback deck to be able to store all the stormwater without raising the water into Tierra Del Mar. So the further you move it north, the better able it is to store that stormwater without backing up. Alternative one was that spot. So the setback deck has effects on habitat. As I said before, there's 1.5 acres of wetland habitat that would be covered by a new setback deck. But on the other hand, the project, by allowing unfettered estuarine tidal function to occur, would restore about 70 acres of natural estuary that's been kind of closed off from the estuary and from marine for many, many years. The natural tide cycle would be restored in about 78% of the land within the range of the tides behind the tide gate and 85% of the marsh within the park. The higher tides north of the setback dike would really be a great benefit for fish and wildlife that would be foraging in that area that are associated with estuarine habitat. There would be full fish passage restored to the mouths of Rannoch and Belts Creeks, and the sediment accretion rate gives us a better chance, better odds of being able to keep up with sea level rise. You can see more specifically the types of habitat shifts that might be expected as a result of this project in these two graphics. Being loosely, since the vegetation data was now in 2016, which is now 8 years ago, if you can believe that, but what we see in the situation in 2016 was we had a lot of high salt marsh, we had freshwater wetlands behind the tidewater coming in, so the water was on balance fresher and less salty than it would be after some sort of modification. So in this situation on the right, the setback dike with a modern type with a 7-foot closure, what we're seeing is that the habitat shifts towards low salt marsh and pushes the other habitats towards the edges of the marsh as more water is allowed to flow in its natural form in the estuary with the setback dike. And this is the same thing in a pie chart format. The big winner for the setback dike scenario is a lot more low salt marsh. In terms of the condition of the habitat that is potentially impacted by the setback dike, this map is ranging from greens to reds, greens being habitat that's in excellent condition, lighter green being good condition, yellow being marginal condition, red being poor condition. And these conditions are largely based on the vegetation that's there. Is it weeds or is it good stuff? And so red is mostly weeds, dark green is almost entirely good stuff. So the effects on private property are a huge consideration here, and the setback dike would block the tides over the high tide gate closure settings from intruding into private property. And since it would allow water to flush out more efficiently, it would dramatically lower the amount of water backup that would happen during big storm events. Sand Lake Road would no longer be overtopped by periodic flooding that results currently from the water backing up in the existing condition. And yeah, that's about it for now. So I mentioned before that there was some self-mitigating aspect to the setback bay. So when you fill wetlands, you have to mitigate for that fill somehow. You have to compensate for that lost wetlands. And this setback bay is about 1.5 acres. So since this is an estuary system, which is defined by the presence of tides and the function of tides, there are a lot of areas that were cut off from tides before that would be restored to tidal condition and would be new estuary that would be created as a result of allowing more natural tide flow through the old belt stay north of the setback bay. I use that term new loosely because this was estuary. It's restored estuary. It's 5.6 acres, so it's a much larger amount of estuary gain than estuary loss. The question mark is whether much of this green is already wetland or not, and we don't know that yet. What's that?
I'm pretty sure it's.
All. It could be.
Yeah, you've got groundwater discharge.
Yeah. So my last slide here is next steps. The next step, the big next step that we've been waiting to do for quite a while that will really inform the next stages of design are geotechnical assessment of constructability and cost, etc. We need to move design forward from its current 30% phase to 100% phase. We need to investigate permitting, exactly what that looks like in terms of mitigation, county permits, FEMA permits, etc. There's a lot of moving parts there. And grant funding is huge. Right now, Toledo Partnership has received a new grant that has allowed us to restart this process with funding that's sufficient to bring us to 100% design, but there's no money yet for implementation or construction. So that's the huge piece that's hanging out there for later. And with that, I've concluded my section and will hand it over to Hunter.
Thanks, Noel.
Yeah.
Hi, everybody. My name is Hunter White again, Civil and Water Resources Engineer with ESA.
I know, it's really hard to deal with.
So I'm going to be giving you, Noel described a great history of the project, how we've gotten to you all. We were presenting the range of alternatives that we evaluated in detail. And today I'll be giving you an update of what culminated from that phase of work. We, landed on this refined preferred alternative and developed a set of 30% design plans based on design report and cost estimate. And now with this next phase of work, as we say here, ESA and a team of our sub-consultants, geotechnical engineers, structural engineers, beaver specialists, will be advancing this project towards final design and permitting. The 30% design, which you'll kind of recognize this figure with a different iteration of it, showing the previous alternatives. This has been updated to reflect what we're proposing for the 30% design to move forward. You'll see here, and by the way, north is down in this photo, so we're just kind of looking at it from Sand Lake, looking up into the marsh and towards Tierra del Mar. So we're showing a single dike breach being crossed with a pedestrian bridge. I'll get into each one of these elements in a little bit more detail moving forward. We're showing Renke Creek and Belts Creek coming in. We'll talk a little bit later about culvert replacement plans in those locations. This yellow line here depicts setback dike alternative one, essentially, that we evaluated in the last phase. So you'll see here that we're not showing all the various alternatives of where the setback dike could go, but the location where we determined with OPRD that met the project goals. And then here we're showing the stormwater and flow inputs from Tierra del Mar, being that East Marsh and No Name Creek, as well as the Sam Lake Road ditch and the Tierra del Mar Northwest ditch flowing in behind the setback dike. So moving forward here, we're going to be looking a lot at, essentially our 30% design drawings, somewhat adapted here for this presentation, but now we're looking again here at Sam Lake on the north end and Tierra del Mar to the south. So here you'll see again the proposed dike breach location and pedestrian bridge. Here, about 70 acres of the marsh being reconnected to Sam Lake, as mentioned, and the setback dike located just downstream or north of the main beaver dam that's out there, leaving about 10 acres of wetland behind the setback dike. We're also considering other interior marsh enhancements, filling segments of the linear drainage ditch and naturalizing some of the channels to be more suitable for habitat. So I'll start zooming in on each one of these elements and talk a little bit more about each one. Here we're zoomed in on the proposed dike breach. We're showing our grading plan for opening up the dike here. And you can see here in cross section down below to maintain trail access, recreational access to the larger trail network within Sickasegg State Natural Area. The plans currently show a 200-foot span pedestrian bridge over this breach, and this is a detail that we'll be refining as we move forward through additional hydraulic analysis, looking at how sediment will move through that breach, the tendency for that to scour erode or fill in with sediment. So we'll be doing a lot more work to determine how big do we make this, how deep do we make this. And then again, right now, looking at the pedestrian bridge as the option that we're moving forward with. We do still have permitting ahead of us, and so as we get into these permitting discussions, we need to confirm that the project as a whole, the boardwalk at this time, but we are proceeding now with the pedestrian bridge as the preferred alternative. Here you can see just a few examples of what some of these prefabricated pedestrian bridges could look like. Not that the Sickasegg Bridge will look like any of these specifically, but these are just examples of prefabricated bridges in the span range that we're talking about here. So now moving on to the setback dike itself. So we've panned ourselves south to the marsh. You can see the kind of the main beaver dam that some of you are familiar with that's out there. Again, we're proposing to locate the setback dike just north of that. Part of that, as Noel mentioned, was to make sure that we had enough storage capacity behind the setback dike to contain all of the stormwater runoff from Tierra del Mar while not increasing water levels, but in fact lowering water levels beyond what currently occurs today. So some of the features that we're looking at, again, the setback dike crossing the marsh here will be tying into the Sam Lake Road on the east end, while kind of a cross-section view of the setback dike itself. So you can see here on the right side, tying into Sam Lake Road a little bit higher, ramping down. This is kind of similar to the road coming off of Sam Lake Road to Wayland Island, to the Wayland Island Bridge. So kind of a similar slope and form there. Crossing down across the marsh, we're generally showing about 10 feet of fill to get up to that proposed height. We have the new tide gate structure right in the middle. And just to explain, the view in the bottom here is vertically exaggerated to be able to show better. So we do have about a 5 times vertical exaggeration. in this image, which is why the tide gate structure itself looks kind of narrow and skinny, because that's been stretched out to show more detail. We will be tying into on the west end to the high ground to create a continuous barrier to prevent that tide water from moving south beyond this feature. Right in the middle, kind of at the main channel or ditch crossing, is where the new tide gate structure would go. We're currently looking at about a 12-foot wide box culvert that would have a tide gate on it, controlled by a new tidal regulator control system. Another feature that we have added are a pair of redundant culverts. So, you know, with this tide gate structure, there will be maintenance program, make sure that the tide gate structure remains operational. But we're also proposing the plan to include some backup culverts, just so that when there is higher water elevated in the marsh, in the off chance that the tide gate structure were blocked in some way, there would be a pair of extra culverts to drain that water off. So looking at the setback back down in cross section. So just showing the, really the height of the setback dike. On the bottom here, we're showing the existing ground surface of the marsh. Again, about 10 feet of fill here. The multiple lines you see here are really showing that we will need to overbuild this dike even higher than we want it to end up, because when you place all of this fill on soft marsh soils, we will experience settlement of the ground beneath. And so we'll likely need to build this dike over at least a 2-year period, doing an initial build height, letting that material settle, come back in, build it up, kind of top it off to where we want, and overbuild it extra tall, so that in 50 years from now, with continued settlement that will occur, the dike will still be tall enough as we look out many decades into the future. I am showing the 12-foot water level here in this blue line, and just to show that, you know, the proposed height of the new dike is a lot taller than even the peak water levels that we see today, both to just have extra room, extra freeboard factor of safety built in to handle those high water levels, as well as to be prepared in the future for sea level rise. We have some, geotechnical investigation and engineering work ahead of us to inform, what do we need to do to the ground before we build this dike. Likely includes removing some of the soft soils, doing other subgrade stabilization measures to create a solid foundation to build the dike. Now I'm zooming in on the proposed tide gate structure itself, and again in plan view. This is again from our design drawing. So you're seeing the elevation and grading contours of the dike, gravel access road on top so that maintenance can be performed easily. We are showing this red outline here. You see, because this is in an area of existing heavy beaver activity, we will need to make sure that beavers aren't going to be able to get in and block this structure. So we are working with ODFW as well as beaver specialists about how to make sure that we do keep beavers away from blocking the structure. You do see here one of these extra kind of redundant bypass culverts that we're proposing, that they wouldn't be flowing all the time, but they would be perched up higher. So not attractive for beavers to plug in the first place, but in the event that something were to happen and the structure were blocked in some way, that we would still have drainage capacity, extra drainage capacity to drain off that high water. These will be fitted with tide gates, most likely just traditional flap gates, not intended for fish passage in any way, but to keep water from coming in, but allow that water to drain out. Again, this, we're getting kind of into some of our engineering drawings. And so this is a cross section of the setback dike at the proposed structure. This would have a concrete floor to it, essentially a large concrete box culvert with the tide gate system associated with it. So really just showing this is, this is kind of the level of design detail we're at right now. My team, as well as the structural and geotechnical engineers that we're working with, have developed a number of these designs in similar settings. So some of the details here are consistent with some other systems that we've built. One of the big steps that we have in front of us is the geotechnical engineering aspect of the project. What I'm showing here right now is actually a soil profile from the Whalen Island Bridge, also in Sand Lake, and just to show that, this is likely similar to what we have at the proposed setback dike location, where we have layers of sediment that have been deposited over many, many years, centuries, and a bedrock layer somewhere down below that ground surface. We know exactly where that is. We do have other indications in the hillsides and rock outcroppings that we can see, but we don't know how deep the soil is to get down to bedrock. And therefore, what we need to do to design and construct the dike and the tight gate structure itself. So here on the right is just an example image of a drill rig that would be collecting these soil borings to develop this sort of soil profile, which will be used to develop the geotechnical engineering designs for the system. As we mentioned, because we are in this area that already has beaver dams, and beavers will likely remain at Stickis Edge after the reconnection occurs. And so we need to, think through and be prepared for how beavers may behave around the new infrastructure. And, beavers are known to plug culverts when it's beneficial for their habitat and where it creates ponded area for them. And obviously blockage of this infrastructure, the culvert that's at Sand Lake Road and the East Marsh Crossing now has a cage around it to prevent some of that blockage. And these blockages obviously have drainage and flooding implications, as well as maintenance implications that will have to be considered moving forward. This is one example of a beaver exclusion device on the upstream end of a culvert. This is a system known as a beaver deceiver, and Skip Lyle, who was credited here, is on our design team for this phase of the project. He's been working it, for several decades on beaver conflict resolution and keeping drainage structures flowing with the presence of beavers. So this is just one example, and actually a smaller version of likely something that we would end up with. And again, we'll be working closely with ODFW to ensure that a system or exclusion measures that we were to implement are meeting Oregon State fish passage law. Here, zooming in, you can see the proposed setback dike just at the very south or bottom end of this figure. And, we've seen in a lot of the images, there's a linear drainage ditch that runs right down the center of the marsh that would have been excavated as a drainage ditch in the past to dry out the land and make it usable for agriculture. When we approach sites like this, typically we consider filling the drainage ditches that were excavated, re-excavating and remeandering new sinuous tidal channels to restore more of the natural channel condition that would have existed prior to the ditching. But in this site, because as Noel mentioned, the vegetation and the wetland is high quality. And so there will be trade-offs to getting heavy equipment out into the marsh to do these sorts of interior enhancements. And so as we look ahead, not only to dig ditches, or excuse me, fill ditches, dig new channels, install large wood structures that we often include for fish habitat, we'll be considering those trade-offs. Is it worth it to get out into the marsh to make these improvements versus the impact that work would cause? We're also proposing to upsize the drainage culvert at Roma Ave and the Sand Lake Road ditch. And this is really the one structure within Tierra Del Mar, the one culvert drainage structure in Tierra Del Mar that is within the reach of current tidal elevations, extreme tides. And this image here shows, you know, back from in 2017. So I know there's been some cleaning of the system, some cleaning of this culvert. But what this image is really showing is that when water is flowing down the Sand Lake Road ditch, this culvert at Roma Ave being undersized is a bottleneck at the bottom of Tierra Del Mar's drainage system. And you can see at essentially the same moment, there's water backed up in the ditch upstream of this culvert, while the downstream end is free flowing. It's not backwatered by tides in this moment. And so this is really just a demonstration of the capacity of this culvert to drain water off of Tierra Del Mar. So we are proposing to upsize this culvert as part of the project to improve the efficiency and drainage capacity of the Sand Lake Road ditch, which in turn should help improve the drainage of the rest of that ditch system. As Noel mentioned, you know, we did in the previous phase do a much more extensive evaluation of Tierra Del Mar's drainage system and identified a number of potential improvements and deficiencies and tough areas that just really have poor drainage to get that water away. Those could be addressed in a future project, but this is the one culvert that, again, is directly within that range of potential tidal influence, and so we are proposing to include that as part of the Sickest Edge project. This is just another view of that Roma Ave intersection with Sand Lake Road. The profile of that Sand Lake Road ditch and essentially showing the upsizing of that culvert, as well as its current position relative to a 12-foot water level or even a 13-foot water level that could be experienced long into the future. With the setback dike construction, we will not, we wouldn't be seeing these 12-foot water levels at this location anymore because that setback dike is going to prevent those high tides from reaching this point, as well as the much larger drainage structure is going to allow this water to escape much faster. Under the existing conditions, we do see 12-foot water levels at Sand Lake Road at this low point. Again, the setback dike will improve these water levels, but again, showing the 12 and 13 foot as just a reference point for the fact that this Roma Ave culvert is currently within that potential tidal range. Along with our 30% plans and basic design report, we also generated a cost estimate, which is summarized here. Categories. I'm not going to go through all of these, but really just to show you, the total estimated construction cost, about $6.5 million for the setback dike, the dike breach, potential pedestrian bridge that, again, we'll be working to refine the details of, and, revegetation of the site of disturbed areas and so forth. So we could, of course, get into that in more detail. I just wanted to show you this information is also going to be available for people to review in greater detail. And so at this point, we've just discussed all of the features associated with the Sickest Edge tidal wetland restoration project itself. And now Chris and I are going to tell you a bit more about the Sand Lake Road crossings and work that we've been doing in parallel.
Thank you. So I'm Chris Lady. I'm the Public Works Director and County Engineer. Wear a variety of hats to go with this. The nice thing about this larger project is the design team with OPRD, TP, and others have decided to take a larger look at this, which includes Remke, Built, and No Name. So from not just Sand Lake itself, but also the roadway network. And I think that speaks a lot to the relationships that we have. So those are the three crossings that we looked at. In particular, we've got where you've got the Sickest Edge, where you park and go out there. You've got Remke Creek is the next one closest to Pacific City. If you look out there, it actually runs in and flows in the ditch line and then crosses on the road. So everybody that travels that, this is the road, this is the location that's over top. This is the spot where you end up going through high water. If you notice recently, people that drive that, the water will go over the top of the road and it'll try to undermine the asphalt. A couple of weeks ago, we put some concrete on the downstream side, concrete bridge beam. So if you're driving by there, you'll see something there that's intended to help protect. further to the south of Mark. So in this particular case, we had a 30%, how about, let me back up. 30% was funded to come up with the design for Reneke, Sand Lake, and the Reneke Creek. So concurrent to that work, we had, because they're doing all the hydraulic analysis for this project. And we wanted to understand that the location of that dike and the impact of that dike. You're going to remove it, you're going to put a tide gate, you're going to set it back. How does that impact Reneke Creek? What kind of to the estuary? So we contracted with completed type size location study. Type, what size should that be and what's location? All that was really part of the hydraulic analysis associated with the dike. So ESA has completed that work, and they were able to, through DEP, is able to identify additional funds to get that up to 100%. So Belts of No Name and Belts of No Name culvert have made it to 30% design and has subsequently funding up to 30%. They are waiting for additional design money for that. Reneke Creek, a little bit more focused on Reneke Creek. The image on the left, that shows the outfall. That's the location where we ended up putting additional concrete that you'll see out there today. So existing conditions, Reneke Creek, as it flows from the coastal range towards there, you can see the original pattern. There used to be a 14-foot bridge that was out there once upon a time. Nobody can tell me exactly where it is, although I do have a great photo of that bridge. It was modified, the creek was modified to locate a situation when the culvert was undersized, and it was carrying a lot of debris that was coming off the range there. Not so much coastal range, but the group of mountains that separate the 101 from here. So all that debris would come down and it would plug the culvert. And then county crew would go out there and they'd unplug the culvert, and the bay would come in and silt the estuary would come in and silt it back up. The county would then open it back up. The next winter, it'd plug up multiple times a year. County at that point, 15 years ago or so, decided to say, okay, let's kind of back off on that. They decided to let Reneke Creek come down the ditch line of Sand Lake and then flow across the culvert at the low point. That's the location where it overtops. So they went through the analysis to identify where the staff can actually transition over from myself back to Hunter. So they looked at location of where should that end up going. So when you look at this in particular, the 1939 to 1953 to 1977, that really started to inform the discussion of what do we need to do today. So with this, I'll hand it back to Hunter.
Thanks, Chris. So as Chris said, you know, in parallel with the Sickness Edge project, we started working on Reneke Creek under a separate contract with the county. We wanted to look as far back as we could at, you know, what condition for Reneke Creek should we recreate here. And going back to the 1939 oldest aerial we could find, you'll notice a few things here. Really, this entire area was forested. Reneke Creek itself, I guess if you look more towards 1977, it's closer to what it looks like today, where Reneke Creek is really just in this narrow band of creek and alder trees essentially that are just a very narrow riparian area that Reneke Creek has been constrained to. So looking all the way, and I guess also just to point out in 1977, as well as still exists today, there's this little triangular patch of forested wetland that still remains. And through this progression of time, you can see slowly the modification of Reneke Creek and this area, this forested wetland area that's been shrunken down to this small triangle that still exists. All the way back in 1939, Reneke Creek was apparently flowing through, reaching the marsh through kind of a multi-threaded channel network. I've traced in blue here these kind of tidal channel features that all kind of radiate towards the Reneke Creek area. As we look into 1953, you can see that those more natural sinuous channels were filled in. This area was being sure, and at that time, show up in the 1950s. So this being a man-made channel that was created in conjunction with the building of the dike, the draining of the land, the rerouting of Reineke Creek to try to get that water away from this area that was being used for pasture. You know, there's been a lot of thought about, you know, should we be restoring Reineke Creek into this channel that some folks remember as the historical alignment of Reineke Creek. But our research is really showing that, you know, that channel was created and, you know, showed up just before 1953. And so, in addition to this historical air photo analysis, we did a analysis of the geomorphology of the system, of really, you know, how does this creek, you know, the basin behave? How does it move sediment? And what we found through analysis of LiDAR elevation data, as well as on the ground observation, is that Reineke Creek, when it comes out of the steep hillside, you know, it's a very steep channel. It has the capacity to move a lot of gravel, but then once it hits the flat floodplain, it loses energy and it comes out of these gravels. And so as that happens over thousands of years, the gravel deposit fills in Reineke Creek's channel. When that channel fills in, it kind of moves itself over, creates a new channel, another big gravel deposit. That channel fills in and it moves over again. And so over the thousands of years, and in the bottom left here, this is a LiDAR map of Reineke Creek. And you can see when it comes out of this steep hillside, you can see this kind of radial fan feature that is typical for this setting. The light blue line, there's my cursor. The light blue line here is roughly where Reineke Creek is today. So you can kind of imagine this as, you know, Reineke, through those modifications that I just showed you, Reineke Creek has essentially been pushed over to the left side of this alluvial fan and really boxed into its current position. We looked at a number of different alignments that we could restore for Reineke Creek. And another thing that we did with the hydraulic modeling is look at, you know, in existing conditions. So what you're seeing here is, you know, the air photo in the background. This is Reineke Creek's current alignment, kind of highlighted in yellow. These are our velocities out of the model. What we're showing here is when we get about a 2-year flow on Reineke Creek, under current conditions, Reineke Creek pops out of its channel in a number of locations. And so again, flowing towards the Sickles Edge parking area, there are low points where Reineke Creek already pops out, and that water, that flood water, as well as groundwater, makes its way down to the low point. This is that kind of triangular patch of forested wetland that still exists today. And so an important point is that, you know, this location right here, where Reineke takes this hard left turn and starts flowing down the roadside drainage ditch, you know, if we were to put a new bridge in this location or open this culvert back up, there are times during high floodwaters when water is going to go down to this low point anyway. And so the county has this low point that overtops. They need a replacement. They need to put in a new bridge and raise the road up in this area. And so it really makes sense to make this the primary crossing point for Reineke Creek to get across Sand Lake Road. You know, another cool thing that we discovered out there is within this triangular patch of forested wetland, there are several channel flow paths that still exist today that were likely part of that natural multi-threaded channel that Reineke once had. And so what we're looking at, and actually, yeah, here, it's a little bit hard to see, but this is just to show that in that triangular forested patch, there are creek channel forms that carry water, not only flood water, but even during the summer, you can see groundwater moving through this area to the low point in Sand Lake Road. So with that, you know, we've developed this conceptual design of, you know, we really want to get Reineke Creek out of that roadside drainage ditch. you know, abandoning that filled-in culvert that has been filled in numerous times in the past, and provide, you know, not only a primary flow path for Renegade Creek to reach this low point, but also try to restore that natural forested floodplain and alluvial fan form that once existed here. You know, we're conditioned to think of creeks as, you know, single threaded channels. And in most conditions, especially in settings like this, more typical is for these channels to actually be multi-threaded, to activate at higher flows. And, you know, even as recent as last winter, we saw another big gravel deposit in Renegade Creek, kind of right around this area. And we are already seeing Renegade, you know, trying to jump out in roughly the same location. So those are a lot of the kind of rationale and thinking, really the background for why we're proposing the design that we are today, which is to construct a new bridge at the low point, 45-foot span, 2-lane bridge, and raise up about 800 feet of Sand Lake Road to get that roadway up above, you know, future tide levels, as well as to make sure that we have enough freeboard beneath and wood. And then while we're at it, to restore the kind of forested floodplain that once existed prior to the 1950s. So yeah, these are just a couple different views. And, you know, also, maybe I'll hand it back over to Chris as we talk about the, you know, roadway and bridge design.
Sure. So we've established that the water wants to flow to the low point, which is where it's going, and that established that's where we want a bridge. So normally we put a bridge, we're not touching the stream at all. So the water's already migrating down to that direction. It's getting pushed by that alluvial fan. It'll eventually show up the road out. By widening the road out, we're pushing the creek away. We really don't want a creek in the functioning in the roadside ditch anyways. It's a bad application for a stream. So one of the unusual aspects of this is that in conjunction with the bridge, we do need to do work on the stream up slope of that. Otherwise, the bridge is actually going to increase in cost because as I raise it up, if I widen it out, I'm going to need a massive wall to keep the stream from where it's going. So it's actually an economical benefit to do something like this and actually go through the stream. So the type classification, we know the type, it's going to be a bridge. The size, we know what the size is going to be. We know what the we know the location of it. So those are the three main factors that we think of when we start looking at bridge design. The addition to this is the stream work. So engineering is put together by ESA and their sub-consultant, David Evans and Associates. So in particular, you're looking at a 2-lane bridge. The bridge is a little over 55 feet in total length, and it is wide enough. You've got 2 11-foot lanes and almost 5-foot shoulders. So we also get a fair amount of bikers on the road. So the issues with this, we do tend to make some of these bridges wider than normal because you can build one lane to carry all the traffic, and then build the other lane to carry all the traffic. So it minimizes the cost of having to do detour structures. So in the middle, you can see the thin line that goes through there. That's the existing culvert. It's a diagonal, runs up and down on the page. That's the existing culvert. So moving on. So we are currently through TEP. We are currently funded to go to 100% designs and permitted. And they actually being taken care of under a TEP contract with ESA. We have, the county has applied for federal highways grant funding for $3 million to construct in partnership with Salmon Superhighway this work. When you look at the Renegade Creek project, and this is specific to Renegade Creek, we're kind of going down 2 separate paths because I didn't want to wait for the permitting and all the complexity that's going to arise with the Salmon Lake. So we're pushing this to current with separate funding tracks. So we applied federal highway. To do the stream, that work is about $1.2 million. The bridge and the roadway portion is about $1.9 million. So when you think of the grand total scheme of the the $6.6 million of the Sitka sedge and that large component, you know, we're almost half of bridges are expensive. So it does take a partnership that's really important for us to continue on. So we're trying to push forward on getting that bridge established as soon as we can. It will take a while. It won't happen overnight. We do need to get grant funding for that. At that point, that's kind of the overview of Renke Creek, and we'll kick it back over for Q&A.
Yeah, so we're gonna be able to take questions from both the online participants and in the audience, and I will need to look here to see whether we have any comments coming in from
Not yet.
in from the online audience, but in the meantime, we're asking that people keep their comments down to 3 minutes if possible, so that we have time for everyone to speak. This group is not that huge, so we'll probably be able to go around more times. Does anyone have any questions or comments?
Bridge. Yes. It's going to be walking, area for walking and also for bicycles. You know, that long of a bridge, we're going to have to accommodate people and bicycles that come down.
So the bridge has 2 lanes. Each lane are 11-foot wide. So your traditional lanes. The shoulders are 4 feet 9 inches. So you have normal shoulders until McCounty is 0. You know, white lines and then nothing. So oftentimes you'll see 1 foot shoulder, maybe a 2 foot shoulder or 0. Very, very anything more than the 12 to 24 inch shoulders. We have almost 5 foot shoulders on either side of that bridge. So the bridge itself will be able to accommodate pedestrians and bicycle movement in both directions.
Yeah. Oh, is there
Another
question? No questions.
Keep rainwater separate from going into the marshland or the ocean. Is there some way to recover that? It would cut down on a lot of the water that accumulates there.
Yeah.
And we could use the water. We're growing interior resort. A lot of building going on. We could use the water.
So you're saying maybe some sort of storage basin for using that water as part of the water system or for irrigation or something to that effect?
Whatever we needed.
Okay. Yeah, that's not something that we've looked into. We'll put that on the list of things that we'll discuss at the next meeting to see if that's something that we can incorporate. Nothing comes to mind. Does anything come to mind for you, Nicholas?
You know, a lot of the stormwater that runs off of the land, you know, as it enters the marsh and enters this mixing zone, you know, a lot of the area now it mixes with that salt water, and so it becomes this brackish mix. You know, I believe, and I don't know if we have Buck here today, but I believe the water from Fort Tierra Del Mar comes from Belts Creek. Is that correct? Y'all would know better. And so with the water, I guess you're kind of talking about, you know, it's separate from that Belts Creek basin. So yeah, I guess I'm not sure, you know, how we would achieve that of kind of capturing that water, or how that would tie in with the water distribution system that exists today. But that is an interesting idea that we can look at.
I suggest maybe pumping.
Oh, yes. Oh. So we might do rainwater, something.
Yeah, thank you.
Kind of answer your question. All the rainwater that we get on Tierra Del Mar is very critical also for Sitka sedge, because that slowly flows through and comes out as groundwater and helps the fish later. So that groundwater that you're wanting to capture is needed later downstream too. We need to think about it.
Isabel has a question.
Thank you. My question was regarding the size of the breach, because every time we have a meeting, it gets bigger, wider. We started with 80 feet, 100 feet, 150 feet. Now we're talking 200 feet, and that's the most expensive out of what we've discussed so far. In the last meeting, we had some dollar amounts, and then the 250 feet was the most expensive. And so I just wondered what the benefits are, given the cost. Is it all for fish passage? I mean, how does that tie into the restoration project and setback bay? Given that this is fish, primarily fish passage restoration project, setback bay project.
Yeah.
Could you explain where, because it's, even in the TP executive summary for the grant funding, it mentions 100 feet, 150 feet. So I'm not sure we're starting another 50 feet wider, and then what those impacts are and how that decision is being made.
Yeah,
And the associated costs.
apologize, I'm flipping through slides. We've got a bunch of extra slides here. In case questions like this can't come up. And so you're right, you know, you're noticing an increase in the size of the breach as we move forward. The initial size of the breach that we were considering was really like, what's the minimum size that would be needed to fully allow the water level in Sand Lake to propagate into the marsh? So how big of an opening do you need for that full tidal connection to occur? When we looked at that in 2019, we had an 80-foot wide breach, and you know, you're seeing some difference in numbers too, because it's narrower at the bottom and about 30 feet wide at the bottom and about 80 feet wide once you reach the top. So that was about the minimum size that would be needed to fully connect hydraulics, tidal hydrology into the marsh. During the last phase of work, we looked at different sizes of that breach, and then of course, with the different sizes of the breach, how do we maintain that trail access? And you know, one thing that you know, one example, you know, as we're talking now about opening up this breach, putting a bridge over it, you know, we need to think about not only how does that water get in and out, but when it is moving in and out, is it going to erode those banks? You know, is that going to be a stable opening? This is an example of a boardwalk bridge in the Swalley National Wildlife Refuge in Washington, kind of near Tacoma or Olympia area. You know, this is kind of a cautionary tale, if you will. You know, this is a similar restoration project. They reconnected this marsh. They put in a bridge over this channel. And back in 2011, they put in a 40-foot bridge to cross that channel. And just about 8 years after that, they were seeing, with that water moving through, they were seeing a lot of erosion. In this image down at the bottom left, you can kind of see that they try to armor the banks here to protect those bridge abutments and, you know, prevent that erosion from occurring, because when that water is rushing in and out, it wants to enlarge that opening just naturally by the water moving in and out. And so one thing we want to avoid is putting in a bridge that's too small and you know, putting in this opening that's too small, and then seeing in 10 years or 20 years from now, erosion has occurred, we're damaging the bridge that we've, you know, put all this effort and money into. And so, you know, right now, we did also look at the hydraulics of how that water would move in and out of a 100-foot breach or a 200-foot breach. And even with the 100-foot breach, we still see some of that swirling occur and higher velocities and potential for erosion. So, you know, that is one thing that we'll be working to refine as we move forward is, you know, how big does it be? You know, if we make it narrower, we may need to put in rock for armoring, which we don't necessarily want to do. And we definitely don't want to compromise the bridge that would be put in. So those are some reasons of why, you know, bigger may be better. Of course, as you're noting, the cost goes up as well, not only for excavation of that material, but for the size of the bridge that would go in there.
If you're higher profile and deeper substructure. The wider you go, the additional cost, then the higher profile and deeper substructure.
Yeah, that's right. And so I guess a lot of the question here is, you know, over the years that we've been looking at this, we've been showing an increased size of the breach and of the bridge that would be needed to span that breach. And with that, you know, the cost is also going up. A 100-foot bridge would be a lot cheaper than a 200-foot bridge. And then as Isabel was just saying, you know, as we mentioned, when you go with these much larger spans, the bridge itself has to get stronger and thicker. And so, you know, right now, as I mentioned in my slide, you know, we're showing that 200-foot bridge right now. That's the biggest that we would propose. That's the biggest that would be reasonable with a single span for a pedestrian bridge. But we're going to be working with state park staff, our structural engineer, as well as additional hydraulic and sediment modeling to really hone in on, you know, how big is big enough, is, you know, safe. We're not going to be compromising the bridge in the future, and then trying to balance the costs associated with that work and the size of the bridge.
But from the notes from the last meeting, it's 200 to 250 feet there. So there's still an additional 50 feet that's potentially being considered. So it could be from the notes from the last meeting.
Yeah, from our structural.
It seems
Yeah,
like the
Isabel
microphone's
said
not working quite right or something.
that in the last presentation, we said a 200 or 250-foot bridge. And, you know, through consultation with our structural engineer, David Evans, you know, we're looking at, you know, what is possible with a single span. You know, we really want to get across this breach with a single span. We don't want abutments to be in the water or, you know, catching debris and that sort of thing. And so, you know, with their input for a prefabricated structure, 250 is about as big as you can go. With these kind of prefabricated, which are, you know, more cost effective than a custom designed, you know, specialty design bridge. So up to 250-foot span is possible with one of these prefabricated systems. We don't see any benefit of going larger than 200 feet from a hydraulic standpoint. But as I said, you know, that's one of we're only at 30% design, you know, even though there's been a lot of work that's gone into the project to get us to this point, there's still a lot of work to go. Both, you know, again, coordinating with OPRD on the bridge itself, and then looking at how that bridge would perform. Yeah, Chris, go ahead.
So I'm not actively really truly involved with the pedestrian bridge. However, dealing with a lot of bridges, one of the things at 30% here is where we're at right now. And as that advances through the 60%, we starting to take a look at some of the constructability issues. And part of this too is when you look at a 100-foot bridge, there's really not much difference between that and a 110-foot bridge. The cost is generally relative until you start changing over a certain size. Part of that has to do with the connections that are made. Part of that has to do with just the transporting material. The foundation requirements for a 150-foot bridge or a 200-foot bridge, the foundation, the piles that are going to be drilled to the ground probably are not going to be that much different, because we're not be driving the interstate truck loading through here. So while it's additional span, it may not truly be that much of additional cost. And that would suspect, based on everything here, is that the next level, when they go from 30 to 60, they start really trying to finalize what does that look like. This is just kind of a normal process. So I can certainly imagine that I would anticipate that construction engineer, the design engineer, is starting to trying to find that balance point. A little high based on the lessons learned, and maybe trying to dial that back down. So not really familiar with this side of it, but that's just something when we go to the engineering world that we looked at.
Yeah, thanks, Chris.
Question back there. Oop. Actually, in the back row was first. Sorry.
Noise demonstrations and stuff. I've hear a lot about fish habitat, and I don't have any information on what they're looking at or what they're finding or what they hope to achieve. So possibly at a future date, you know, the ODF and W can get a report on that.
Yeah, and you know, we've had ODFW involved in this process all along, and you know, continue to. You know, I'm coordinating right now with, you know, the local district biologists as well as the state fish passage program coordinators about this project. And you know, really at each one of these locations, there are different issues. You know, the main goal with all of this really is improving fish access from Sand Lake into Belts Marsh and into specifically Reneke and Belts Creeks.
What do you look like? What species are you talking about?
Which fish species?
Well, from what I understand, we're talking mostly about coho, of course, because it's the endangered species, but I've heard chum used to be in the system. I've heard, of course, coastal cutthroat trout are in the system. Chinook, probably not in there, but I think mostly coho and coastal cutthroat trout would be the main ones. And chum if they're still around. I'm not a fish expert, that's what I've heard of. Greg, a question up here?
Yeah, I'm gonna piggyback on that comment. And because my question really was about, we've been talking a lot about flow and hydraulics and fish passage. But I haven't really heard a lot of discussion about fish habitat, which seems like it's a really important part of this whole thing. It just seems to me like if we breach, when we breach the dike, let's just say, the area south of the dike and north of the setback dike, that's going to become over time, like Sand Lake, I'm assuming. Okay, maybe it's not a correct assumption, but I think it's going to, over time, that's what's going to happen. So I guess the question is the habitat of Sand Lake what we want to achieve?
I think it's a little bit higher than Sand Lake.
So the question.
Oh, yeah. Can I repeat the question? Okay, so are we going to see the habitat south of the existing dike and north of the setback dike? Something more like Sand Lake now with, I assume you mean like lots of mud flats and small patches of vegetation, or are we going to see more contiguous vegetation? And I think it's higher ground inside the existing dike than outside, mostly, and it would be mostly vegetated with that, say, foot tall marsh vegetation, largely pickleweed and fleshy jalmia and that kind of stuff that's in that that lowest tier of vegetation, which has been told, which ODFW has told us is really excellent rearing habitat for salmonids. I don't know for sure that there's not going to be a lot of mud flats inside of the dike. That all depends on scour, how things sediment accumulates. There's a lot of dynamics there that we can't really predict at this point, is what I would say. But the elevation does seem to be a little bit higher than Sand Lake,
Yeah, it is. And, I guess I'll just quickly add that, the elevations of the bed out in Sand Lake, you're at about 3 feet elevation, up to 5 feet. We see that water level fall to about 5 feet because there's sand features further out that are keeping that water from draining out any lower than that. The bed out there is generally at about 3 feet, up to about 5 feet. As we get into the marsh, of course, there's areas within the site now that are open water. And really those are the areas that will remain as, almost always flooded and won't likely grow vegetation. But the areas that are currently vegetated are up a bit higher. They're 6, 7. As we approach Terre Lamar, we're more at the 9-foot elevation, and those areas will remain vegetated. We're talking about not only these big connection moves, but as I said, we would like to utilize the channel network in there. We would like to get large wood additions in there, all geared towards improving fish habitat specifically. And then also, the area of Reneke Creek downstream of Sand Lake Road, if you walk through there, you'll see kind of the evolution of that channel already taking place of, there is beaver activity, there's sorting of those gravels, there are braided channels occurring. There are a lot of fish in that lower area of juvenile fish that, walking the site with ODFW, observing that these are salmonids, juveniles already in this area. And we see fish right at that Reneke Creek culvert, the pool that's downstream there. You can often look down in that pool and see many fish, wanting to work their way further up. Even in the ditch, we see juvenile salmonids in that ditch. And of course, that's not the best fish habitat, the straight ditch, angular rock coming off the road embankment. So all of these other actions that we're proposing are really to improve that habitat.
Do the small fry and juvenile fish want fresher water or saltier water?
They, well, I'll just say, I'm an engineer.
So the question was
Oh,
whether
thank you.
the juvenile fish want freshwater or saltwater water. Did I get that right?
Yeah, and also just say, I'm a hydraulic engineer and I represent a much larger team at ESA of biologists, landscape architects, fish biologists, and ODFW, of course, we've had them at the table. I'll just say from my own knowledge that, the juvenile fish, as they're growing up, they are changing from freshwater preference or biology to, morphing their bodies to handle saltwater. And so they actually need this mixing zone of the estuary. And this estuary where we have the saltwater and the freshwater mixing is actually critically important for them to be able to grow up, develop the ability to handle saltwater and get bigger by feeding before they go out to the ocean. So both.
I just know that all the restoration they've done in the Salmon River estuaries, their highest fish area for habitat for this transition is the farthest back estuary that has the most groundwater, not the ones that are closer that are saltier. And I just wanted to know if we're looking at how the salinity at that part of the Salmon River estuary compares to what we're creating here. Are we going to be maybe making this with some of these designs saltier than what we could, or yeah, saltier than what the fish would want as they transition?
You know what I mean?
I think it's referencing the Salmon River restoration project and monitoring that. I guess that the higher fish presence is being seen in freshwater dominated areas. Is that the question? And if what we're doing with this project is going to, negatively affect that situation, are we adding too much saltwater to this area? And so, I think important to point out that, before the construction of the dike, there was this mixing. There was this, Sand Lake had the ability to push this saltier water further up, all the way to Tierra del Mar. And we will continue to have these freshwater inputs from the Tierra del Mar drainage system, the groundwater moving through and beneath Tierra del Mar and everywhere, off of the hillside from Renicky and Bells Creek, the groundwater, moving from those areas, discharging into the marsh. We won't be changing that. We will still have those freshwater inputs, and this will, in the future, continue and even more so to be this mixing zone of those conditions. So I am not personally familiar with the details of the Salmon River estuary, and I think, that's definitely something that we can look at and try to get a handle on, these high productivity areas and how to maximize some of that. With the beaver activity specifically, both at the south end of the marsh, as well as in the Renicky Creek system, those beaver dam impoundments also, slow down the movement of water, create these, pockets of fresh water and, further stratify this mixing zone of that water, this gradient of very fresh water in the upper system, very salty water in the lower system, and where they meet, further complicated by the roughness and complexity of the beaver dams and other channel formations. I don't know if I answered your question exactly, but
I'll read it out.
yeah, thanks.
With the setback dike, are there any plans to make that accessible for pedestrian use?
That is yet to be
And if you
determined.
can repeat the question, sorry.
Sorry, it's so hard to remember. With this yet to be determined, there are some safety issues related to parking along the roadside that would need to be resolved. We had talked about it, that maybe the access could be from the west only, or there might have to be some other kind of trail conveyance there to try to keep people from parking along the roadsides and causing a hazard. So
And follow-up question, I know when initially, with Discovery, there was a lot of great native plants that were found in this area that they were not aware existed here. I'm sure there's gonna be some of that sort of establishment, this new project. Kind of curious, just because a lot of that on the west side, they're showing like different types of strata systems that we created as a part of this plan. So I'm curious if like that trail network would potentially stop a bit to be able to access it, as you said, on the west side.
I'm sorry, I'm only hearing like 50% of what you're saying.
Sorry, so I know that when we first did the discovery of this area, there was a lot of native plants that were found that they were not aware grew here, which is amazing. And so, just like the establishment of those plants and propagation, I'm curious if with the new ecosystems that are being potentially developed because of this plan, like along the west side, you're showing different levels of strata, the different the layers. If potentially that would be, I love the idea of like the public getting more knowledge and like, you know, signage and seeing these plants and understanding like how these systems work. So just having like this trail network come further south on that west side, potentially access that.
Yeah, so the question is, with the vegetation diversity and interesting plants, et cetera, that are occurring out in the marsh now, and with the changes that we're envisioning for the marsh, will there be an opportunity to facilitate their persistence and also be able to interpret those, provide access to those areas of special plant communities and special plant species? And absolutely, the vegetation niches for these plants are like bathtub rings, right? All of these plants occur at very specific elevations and relative to the sea level. And so it's very easy to predict where these plants are going to want to be, and we can plant them to be in exactly the right spot once we know what the hydrology will be, and then plan recreational access around those too, and interpretive access around them. Other questions? Let's see if nothing online still. Did we tire you all out? I think we're like 15 minutes over. Oh, one more question.
No, it's fine. That's fine. I'll wait.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks everyone. Thanks for participating. Sorry about the technical hiccups there. I knew it was going to happen, but you know, this is the nature of these new hybrid meetings. No. Yeah, if people want to look at our website, it's kept up to date. We have links on there to materials, including this meeting. Will be available on the website, and there's a new fact sheet up there now. Place to sign up for email notifications of future meetings and anything that we're mailing out in terms of notes, etc. So if you go on there, you'll be able to sign up for the email list and access everything that we're posting up there. I think I mentioned in an email to a lot of you that received an email already about this meeting that we're planning on basically echoing this meeting in January and reaching out to a much wider audience as well. We've taken down all of the addresses and names of all the property owners that are within, you know, something like a mile or half mile or so of the property, to reach out via mail to invite people to this process in the future. So the January meeting, same content, more people. So that's coming up soon. Right, thank you. And